trips out west, um, I had noticed in a restaurant in Montana, they actually, it was the restaurant here that had previously gotten in trouble. So it was kind of an odd flex on their end. But they had posted this newspaper clipping about how they had illegal meat being sold at this restaurant. And then actually got in trouble for that from Fish and Wildlife law enforcement in Montana, and I think there was a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service investigation as well. So the reason I add that image, one, it's interesting, but also it was kind of little things like that in my undergraduate years, and then moving into my graduate years, that really started sparking my interest in this topic of wildlife crime. So to further introduce myself, and if you joined early, you probably heard some of this. And I know some of this was already stated, but I'm originally from Virginia. These images you see here is where I grew up. I spent most of my time outdoors playing, hiking, fishing, pretty much any of those type of activities. And I really grew fond of particularly southern Appalachia and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I have a deep appreciation for that area. And now that I've traveled more, I have an even greater appreciation for all types of areas, and in particularly wildlife, because as somebody that never really hunted or fished, I particularly do fish more now, but I never had the appreciation for those type of activities, but more so just the animals and the wildlife themselves. And now I have a greater appreciation for all of the type of activities that we can enjoy on our public lands here in the United States. But really, just kind of a series of events throughout my youth, and then in particularly my research and graduate education, I kind of noticed that there was a disconnect between the social sciences and the more traditional natural sciences. And really, this came about in my undergraduate studies at Virginia Tech, where I actually earned a bachelor's degree in forest resources and environmental conservation. And much of that education was focused on the traditional measurements, particularly for timber harvesting. I eventually actually did do work as a forester upon graduating. I also worked as a GIS technician for a private organization as well as a state organization. But one of the most exciting things that I was able to do upon graduating from Tech was working on the Appalachian Trail. And this was part of a multi-year research project with the National Park Service and the U.S. Geological Service, as well as faculty at Virginia Tech. And in this project, I really started to see that there is space for interdisciplinary work between collecting traditional measurements of soil loss, as well as creating opportunities for things like trail design. How do you get people to stay on the trail? How do you get people to not litter, as an example? And that's kind of where I started seeing these crossovers or these interdisciplinary connections between the social sciences and the natural sciences. I also, while working on the Appalachian Trail, saw a lot of crime, whether that was more traditional crime, such as illegal drug use, theft, even. But I also saw natural resource crime, people illegally hunting while we're hiking in the middle of Maine and there's no road within 10 miles. There are people out there poaching on private lands and as well as public lands. And things like that really got me interested in the criminal aspect of understanding, one, why do people do this? How are they doing it? And how do we stop it? So that led me to pursuing a criminal justice master's degree at Radford University, which is right down the road from Virginia Tech. And I wrote a thesis that focused on fisheries compliance, and particularly how do people understand fishing regulations? If any of you have fished or hunted before, you know that those regulations are also oftentimes convoluted and difficult to understand, but they also have a spatio-temporal aspect to them. They are heavily dependent on geography as well as time of year, and there's a lot of overlap with the species themselves. So I tapped into that. And then I still was like, what do I want to do? Do I want to get a PhD in criminology or natural resources? I went back and forth, and how a lot of things work in academia, whoever gives you money, you kind of just go that way. So I went to the University of South Carolina, where I pursued a PhD in criminology. I actually did not have the opportunity to focus my dissertation on natural resource crime, but I did focus it on my other primary concentration and line of expertise, which is spatial and quantitative methodologies. And so that brings me to kind of my general research interest are the conservation criminology, which I'll expand on more, but particularly spatial analysis. Just in any of my past research projects, I have always involved some spatial element, whether that's traditional criminology, understanding how crime occurs in the middle of Atlanta or any other location, as well as some topics related to law enforcement. But I've now, with much more time on my hand, well, not necessarily time, but more freedom to study what I would like. I'm focusing the topics more so on natural resources, particularly wildlife crime, while still applying the spatial methodologies. Because as you'll see in this talk, it's very important to understand where these problems are occurring, as well as when, in order to appropriately address them with the hopes of actually preventing the crime from occurring in the first place. So to kind of give you all an idea of how I frame things, how I think of criminology in terms of applying it to research and these problems I'll discuss, it really starts with what's referred to as the opportunity theoretical framework. I'm not big into theory, but as a social scientist, you have to be into some type of theory. And traditional criminology, and what many of you probably think that entails, is really understanding why. That comes straight from sociology. Why are people doing whatever they're doing? In criminology, what they're doing is criminal behavior. That's what most people study. However, there is another section or kind of subdiscipline of criminology that's oftentimes referred to as crime science, or more confusingly, environmental criminology. But the environmental component is actually just referring to space, not actual environmental issues. It gets confusing. But nonetheless, that kind of subdiscipline really focuses on prevention. We're not so much focused on why people are doing what they're doing. We're focusing on stopping whatever they are doing. And that really works well with this image I have here, this framework of understanding where individuals begin their kind of activity, how they move from A to B, and then B ultimately being where crime is committing or have a higher likelihood of being committed. And you'll see three kind of general concepts come into play and converge both in time and space to create a suitable environment for crime to occur. The first is the motivated offender. That is the traditional criminology coming at play. And for much of what I study now, particularly wildlife poaching, that motivated offender piece, it is important, but it's not as important as you would think, because most crime occurs for reasons that are economically motivating to that individual. Those can be varying based on the opportunity themselves, but we generally understand that people do what they want if it's going to benefit them economically. And that's particularly true with wildlife poaching as well as wildlife trafficking. So we kind of take that assumption that that already exists, and it's very hard to actually tackle that. A lot of the explanations between or of why people commit crime is because they are impoverished. They don't have economic opportunities to kind of excel in other areas. Well, the solution to that would be to end poverty. We know it's not as simple as that. So that's why it's important, at least in terms of what I study, to focus less on that motivation and focus on these two other components: the suitable target or victim, which in our case is going to be animals or other natural resource products, and then the lack of capable guardianship. And importantly, you may be thinking, oh, is that just police? No, it's actually usually not police. It is anybody that has some element of deterrence. And that could just be their simple presence without them even knowing that they are potentially deterring someone from doing this illegal activity. If any of you have ever seen somebody litter, usually people do that because they don't think anybody is around. So they just, conveniently litter. However, a lot of people, and research has shown this previously, particularly in protected areas, if somebody else is around, without even saying anything, that person that was originally motivated to litter is probably not going to do so now. Now, that doesn't stop them from walking 10 more feet and not being around that person anymore that originally deterred them. But in that moment, they made the decision to not do that behavior. And that's what most of my research is about, and particularly the other individuals that I oftentimes work with in criminology who also study wildlife poaching. We all use this exact same kind of theoretical framework. So, at the broadest level, my understanding is opportunities exist everywhere in the world to commit crime. It's important to understand information related to nodes, edges, and that's kind of the spatial understanding of how do individuals get from point A to point B, and then what are they actually doing in that moment in point B. And that's that kind of decision making process of whether or not they're going to commit some type of criminal activity. So, with this perspective, that kind of decision to actually make in the moment, as I said, is going to be based in risk and reward. This could be subconscious. It oftentimes is. We don't usually see people out in the world making a pros and cons list, but that's essentially what they're doing subconsciously. Should I do this behavior, and is it going to benefit me? Oftentimes, we make decisions as humans that are immediate benefits, and we don't really consider the long-term consequences. You see this all the time with traditional crime. I need money right now. I have the opportunity to rob this person on the street, and I'm going to do that. I'm not thinking about the long-term consequences of potentially getting injured in this attack myself as the attacker, being arrested, getting convicted, sentenced to X amount of time in a correctional facility. And that's where bounded rationality comes into play. And this is originally from an economic perspective, but we only have so much information to work with. And while we do think we oftentimes make decisions that are benefiting us, oftentimes they're not, because we don't take into account those long-term consequences. And so, using kind of that idea, I have two, and this is usually for students, and I tailored this first question for you guys just by throwing UGA in there. But the point stands that if you look at these examples, and I'll read one of them, everyone has the opportunity to commit crime. Oftentimes, particularly as we're all involved in academia, we kind of see ourselves as not able to be criminals. We can't do that, or we're not criminals. But in reality, we have all committed crime before. Most of that, hopefully, is low-level stuff, speeding, running a red light, whatever. Maybe some of us have even committed more traditional violent crime. You don't have to admit to that. But nonetheless, we oftentimes kind of categorize us versus them. Those people that have actually gotten caught for whatever crime they've committed, they're the criminals, not us. There's no way that we could be like them. But given the right opportunity, everyone will make a decision that if that opportunity benefits them, they will ultimately take that route. And so, usually, the example I give to students is the second one, where all of them are like, yeah, I would definitely do this. And so, that is after picking up your books from the bookstore, at the beginning of the year, you notice on the receipt you were not charged for one of your books, but this book is only $10. Are you going to say anything? Most of my students always tell me, no way, screw the bookstore. They already took enough of my money. It's their mistake. In reality, if you actually knowingly do take that book with the knowledge that it was a mistake on part of the business, that is an example of fraud and theft. So you could actually be charged for that. $10, probably not, because that's so low of a misdemeanor. Regardless, the point stands, you are knowingly doing some type of criminal behavior. Same thing with the example if the book was even more expensive. The crime is actually getting more serious, but oftentimes my students tell me, oh, well, I'm saving even more money. That's even more so on the fault of the bookstore. So screw them. The point being, we have all decided in specific moments that we will take or accept kind of these criminal opportunities. And now that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, we all do it. But some people, given the right opportunities, can actually accept these opportunities that are much more serious. And particularly in terms of wildlife crime, we're talking about populations that are not widespread. Um, we're talking about things that don't exist very much anymore, or things that can only lose a certain percentage of the population before we see extremely detrimental effects. And that's where the prevention really comes into play with much of my research, in that we must protect these things immediately and worry kind of about that motivation and some of those longer term solutions after the fact. So it's extremely important to address these issues in kind of the immediacy of the issue itself, and then worry about some of the longer term actions down the road. So there's 10 points, 5 on this slide, 5 on the next. I kind of want to bring this opportunities for perspective together for all of you to really understand that, firstly, opportunities play a role in causing all crime. If you understand crime through this lens, then that means it's preventable. Because if you can address one of those 3 issues, and particularly, or one of those 3 components I showed you originally on that triangle image, that's where you can really tap into preventing crime. And as I said, usually we're focusing on the capable guardianship component or the target itself, making it unavailable. It's also important to understand that criminal opportunities are highly specific. We're not just talking about crime in general or even wildlife crime. We're talking about something as specific as poaching of Venus flytraps, now an endangered species that was once highly endemic to areas on the Carolina coast and maybe a little bit of sprinkling in Georgia. Um, that is something that's specific, and I'll show you an example here soon as well. But the reason these opportunities need to be understood as highly specific, because the same person that is paying a guide to go on a hunt in Africa and then paying that guide extra to hunt an animal that maybe they didn't have a permit to hunt is extremely different than somebody in rural Georgia, bagging an extra deer that they did not have a permit or tag for. Those are 2 different types of crime. The outcome is still similar, being wildlife poaching in those cases, but you would address both of those differently. It's also important to understand that, as I said previously, all opportunities are concentrated in time and space. It's extremely important to understand that where these activities occur and when is integral to preventing them in the future. This one's pretty easy to understand. If, for example, in South Dakota, where I previously spent time as an assistant professor, pheasant hunting is huge. People travel all over the world. During a specific time of the year, pheasant hunting completely legal within the regulations. Other times of the year, no more pheasant hunting. And so that's extremely important as a kind of baseline understanding that at one time of the year, this is completely legal. The exact same behavior a few months later is now completely illegal. And so you have to understand time and space. Related to that is point number 4, that crime opportunities depend on everyday movements of activities. This is what I was tapping into earlier, understanding how do individuals actually get from A to B? What are they doing? How are they moving around kind of space? And how are they getting to these opportunities? And then ultimately, you can confront what they're doing in those kind of specific areas later on. Number 5, one crime produces opportunities for another. This is especially important in wildlife trafficking, because oftentimes what we'll see is the individual that actually does the poaching of the elephant for ivory, they then sell that ivory to someone else that has already hired them. Well, actually, they just give it to them and they've already been hired to do the poaching. That individual then traffics it across international borders. sells it in a different market, oftentimes an Asian market. And then from there, it is turned into a powder, it is turned into a decorative piece, sold illegally again, usually to individuals in Europe or the United States. And now it's possessed illegally. And also, what we're talking about is the shipment, the movement of these products. Essentially, what has started as one crime, the wildlife poaching, ends up converging and producing more opportunities down the road. This is a little bit easier to think too of a home burglary. Somebody breaks into your house, that's one crime. If maybe they actually encounter the homeowner and then attack the homeowner, that's another crime that oftentimes can occur. But generally, what they're doing is seeking to take items, sell them at a pawn shop, oftentimes, which is another crime, use that money to then buy drugs or some other illicit material. And again, that's another crime. And then this cycle kind of repeats. And so it's really important to understand where you want to address this issue. Is it at the source, or is it at some other element down the line? And in the case of elephant poaching, we particularly want to address this issue at the source because we only have so many elephants. We can't just try to address it after the fact. Some products are more tempting than others. This is kind of an obvious assumption, but sometimes we forget that just like with technology, one thing that maybe was oftentimes sought out, if anyone remembers Motorola Razr phones, those used to be the coolest thing ever. If you had that now, I guarantee nobody's probably stealing it from you, maybe to put in like a museum or something. But if you have the latest and greatest or something that is much more valuable and oftentimes smaller, easier to actually obtain and take, then people are going to be more tempted by that. The same thing applies with wildlife products. If for whatever reason there's a new trend, let's say for cherry timber, cherry timber, when I worked as a forester, is oftentimes some of the best wood you can find. It's worth the most. But there are just not beautiful cherry trees everywhere. We would call them veneer if they were a certain height and width. That was the high dollar stuff, and we would specifically mark out that timber as being extremely valuable. That's much more tempting than a general pine tree because those are everywhere and they're not really worth anything. And oftentimes they just get scrapped or pulped to make paper. So it's important to understand that an elephant is probably more tempting than some other animal in Africa, say a zebra or something. But they can both be tempting, one usually more so than the other. Related to the points that we're just making, though, is number 7, social and technological changes are going to produce new crime opportunities. This one I'm starting to think about more and more, particularly as drones are more widely available. You see the use of drones twofold in wildlife, the kind of the understanding of wildlife. One, from researchers being able to actually track animals now much more frequently and oftentimes without having to go out in the field and only kind of see a small visualization of, for example, a herd of animals. Now you can see the entire herd or much larger proportion of the herd from the air and also without disturbing them as much. On the flip side, if I'm a wildlife poacher and I'm searching for an animal, let's say wolves, and I want to know where the nearest wolf den is potentially, I can also use that exact same technology to now assess areas that are potentially more viable for wolves, but also to help me understand how can I get to these areas. Google Maps is another tool. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the stories where people are just randomly searching on Google Maps and come across a new Mayan temple in South America. Well, Google Maps can also be used with all the information that provides us free by individuals that are using it for nefarious purposes. How do I get into these areas that are potentially dangerous? Or how do I find where a potential trail or water source is that I could follow into, the deepest part of the jungle? Related to the prevention is point 8. We understand all of these kind of assumptions now. then that means we can prevent crime by reducing opportunities. If all of these assumptions really are true, these opportunities exist out in the world, then if we reduce them, then we should also prevent crime or make it much more difficult for people to kind of seize on those opportunities. And that's kind of the whole goal. And oftentimes I get asked, well, if we target this area, aren't the criminals just going to go somewhere else? No. And pretty much most, if not the vast majority of research in traditional settings, so in urban areas, suggests that this is true. If you have a drug market on one corner of a neighborhood and you aggressively police or target that corner however you want, that crime is going to reduce in that area. But oftentimes, what happens is a diffusion of benefits where those benefits of lower crime in that area are actually going to spread out to adjacent areas. It is not going to be the inverse where those individuals who are committing crime there just seek a new area. Oftentimes, people don't seek areas to commit crime. Again, they just came across those areas or these prime opportunities, and that's why the crime was occurring in that location in the first place. So it's all about understanding that these specific locations were important to begin with, and it's not as easy to change another location to match that earlier location. Yes, of course, people can move around, and that does occur to some degree, but it's usually not at the same level that we were originally targeting. And then lastly, focused opportunity reduction can actually produce much wider declines in crime. And this is to that earlier point of being very specific when addressing issues. When we're talking about a drug market, it's not that we're just targeting these general people that are selling the drugs themselves. We're understanding, what are they actually selling? Why are they selling that? When are they selling it? And to who? And if we really focus our strategies on a kind of addressing these multiple research questions, we're going to have a much better understanding of what's actually driving this problem. And then that usually will kind of, as I said, diffuse to other areas and additionally other problems, and hopefully reduce those problems from existing as well. So I usually always ask the question, is opportunity actually the root cause of crime? Many people think there are biological or psychological or even sociological, kind of the nature versus nurture argument, free will, things like that are really driving individuals. But I always beg the question, and kind of more so, does it influence crime? That opportunity is really the more important thing to study. It's okay to want to be interested in why people do what they do. And we have so many explanations from that without really any concrete answers oftentimes. But if we really want to focus on preventing crime, and as I said, why that's so important in the wildlife space, then we have to understand that opportunity is playing a large role with a lot of these issues. So, conservation crime science is kind of that subdiscipline that I would put myself into, as well as the other or my colleagues that oftentimes really study wildlife poaching or timber theft, illegal fishing at global scales. There's really only a handful of us that are true criminologists studying these issues, and we all kind of call ourselves crime scientists because crime science really is a interdisciplinary approach, but it's always focused on prevention. And as I said, it's always using kind of that opportunity lens to understand issues and hopefully create policies or strategies to address these issues. So, with conservation crime science, what you're seeing is really a blend of traditional criminology and kind of the more preventative approaches with conservation. And we all know that many issues related to the environment are global problems. And it takes an interdisciplinary approach, both the social sciences as well as the natural sciences, to really address these issues. Of course, we need people out in the field collecting data on wildlife populations, their movements, as well as where they live, how much we should expect in this area at this given time of year for this given species. All of that information is obviously vital, but it's also extremely important, as I usually tell colleagues and students, that all of that and the reason we even have laws and regulations for nature or on nature is to protect nature from us, humans. All environmental laws you see here on this slide governs human behavior for nature. So essentially, we're protecting nature from and for our own enjoyment. We recognize that, yeah, we are the ones harming nature oftentimes, but we also have to protect it from ourselves, but for our future use as well. And that's why it's extremely important to always focus on prevention when looking at certain issues. As I said, time and time again, there's only so much of certain resources, and we have to tackle these issues as immediately as possible. So, some of the strengths, though, that really come along with conservation crime science play into the interdisciplinary approach, and that really allows it to overcome limitations that are oftentimes very reductionist from a single discipline that usually will fail to address, particularly the social science aspect and how complex human behavior is, and particularly human environmental relationships. And really, by situating conservation issues with a broader kind of socio-ecological system, conservation criminology or crime science really is seeking to link individuals' social and environmental factors while addressing kind of the interconnectedness and feedback loops that drive conservation crimes. Now, of course, there are weaknesses, particularly there are global North-centric perspectives. Many of you are probably familiar with issues, oftentimes that involve particularly white academics from the United States going to heavily impoverished areas in Southeast Asia, as well as Africa, even South America, and telling them how they should govern and why they should protect this particular species because we think it's pretty or it has some intrinsic value or, arguments that are also more based in ecological biodiversity. Well, that tiger that just attacked that village in Southeast India, guess what? They don't really care. They're just trying to have their crops and cattle protected as well as themselves from this tiger. And when that tiger comes into their village, because, for whatever reason, oftentimes it's been pushed out of its natural habitat and it attacks a citizen of this area, that's a hard play to really say, you know what, let's let the tiger live and kind of do what it wants because we don't have many of them. That village is not going to be really respondent or receptive to that kind of argument. So it's very important to understand that oftentimes these perspectives that we have, because we think we know the science better than others, we don't live in the environments that oftentimes are experiencing these issues anymore. And it's oftentimes, as I said, a really hard sell to go to these areas and tell these people that are usually heavily impoverished that they can't do this anymore. And as I said, that's oftentimes what's driving the motivation to begin with, is just lack of economic opportunities. And then one of the particular examples I always like to highlight, and I know you can't see this very well, whoops. But if you look this up on your own, and I'll explain it a little bit, this is situational crime prevention. It's based in addressing problems through the opportunity lens. But really, there are these 25 techniques that are categorized in these 5 categories that are extremely effective. And this has been applied to both traditional criminal settings as well as wildlife settings, as I'll show you on the next slide. But essentially, these are very simplistic things. Many of you are already familiar with these in terms of managing land. One such example is controlling access to facilities. This is installing gates on a Forest Service road, and then also making sure that those gates are locked when they should be locked. For any of you that are experienced hikers, you've seen all kinds of signs. Oftentimes, these signs are torn down or worn by the weather, and you don't know what they're saying anymore. Maintaining things like that. making signage that is easy to understand for any of the users. These are very simplistic but extremely effective ways of targeting different situations that oftentimes could lead to kind of those increased criminal opportunities. So, the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, which is housed at Arizona State University now, in the policing realm, is the kind of most successful publisher of data on problem-oriented policing. And I'm not really going to talk so much about what that is, other than it's really a highly specific way of addressing problems that oftentimes doesn't even involve law enforcement. It's really based in those 25 techniques on the previous slide that are oftentimes much more focused, simple, cheap, and extremely effective strategies. And a few years ago, the center actually developed a kind of uh, new topic area on wilderness problems. And so if you actually go to their website, they have all these topic areas based on highly specific problems all over the country. And they have these guidebooks that are published and kind of the standard for all of the knowledge about what this problem is. And usually, police commissioners, higher ups in governments use these guides to address problems they may be having in their own communities. And I was actually fortunate enough to write the very first guidebook for this new topic area on wilderness problems. And as you see, my guidebook is pretty specific in that it's addressing wildlife poaching, but only on US federal lands. So you all, I'm sure, know which lands that all entails, but National Park Service, US Fish and Wildlife, BLM, so on and so forth. Essentially, we have many different types of agencies managing federal lands where wildlife poaching occurs. And rather than just focusing on conservation law enforcement, implementing, and as previous research has found in kind of the wildlife space, implementing these techniques of situational crime prevention are oftentimes the most effective ways of actually reducing incidents of, in my case, wildlife poaching on these federal lands. So if you think about Yellowstone National Park, one of the big issues is that the park itself, while very large, is surrounded by private land, usually ranch land. And the animals that live in the park don't stay in the park, obviously. It's not a zoo, they can travel. That's where the problems occur. And really, what we found is that focusing kind of on those peripheral areas is the most important because that's where you're seeing most of these incidents. This wolf was on my private ranch. Maybe it did kill a few head of cattle. It went back onto federal land. I shoot the wolf, drag it back over onto my property. We're seeing these kind of issues become much more common. And I know in that example, it's kind of like an adjacent to federal land, but it's involving the federal land. And that's one example of really recognizing how specific these problems are and that it's not as simple as somebody just, is cruising around in Yellowstone and sees a grizzly bear and just decides to go hunting that day. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing very specific things occur. And that's why it's really important to understand that that specificity needs to also be applied on the preventative strategy side of the equation. Much of my recent research has involved understanding IUU fishing, so illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. So this is a problem that occurs in the high seas, particularly, so outside of countries' exclusive economic zones. And this is a global issue. And really, one of the biggest things is, in my first example here, understanding what is even going on. How do we even detect this? Now, to kind of provide you a basis of understanding, most ships that are doing any type of commercial fishing of a certain size have GPS beacons, AIS symbols as they're called. And that is alerting not only kind of the public, but other ships as to where that ship is, so they don't hit each other. That's important for us to understand and have access to that type of data because usually you don't want to broadcast your location when you're doing something illegal. And so what we've noticed, and other researchers, particularly from Global Fishing Watch, is just kind of a Google-led endeavor to detect this type of activity, is that a lot of ships will go to areas, and in those areas for months at a time, they will not transpond their location anymore. And then they will appear somewhere else on the globe, and they're offloading fish all of a sudden. Where did they get these fish? Well, clearly, kind of connect the dots. We're generally understanding that, yeah, they're turning their beacons off for usually a nefarious purpose. Now, there are legitimate reasons why they may also do this, um, and that's the problem. How do we know that the ships that actually went dark were doing it for illegitimate or illegal purposes? Well, we have a lot of research, particularly from one of my colleagues at John Jay in New York City, where we have focused on what are referred to as flags of convenience. And just long story short, essentially, you will have companies, usually based in China, that will buy a ship in one country and then register it in another country. And essentially, what you're seeing is multiple layers of shell companies essentially being created that's hiding the original owner of the ship. You'll also have crews from other countries that can change kind of the understanding of how you're going to flag your ship. So generally what's happening is ships that have flags from certain countries, these are the flags of convenience, are oftentimes the ships doing these nefarious activities. Why do they get these flags? Again, it's easier. There's corruption in the local government. The ports that assign these flags are oftentimes controlled, as we've found recently in our research, by Chinese investment firms or China as a whole, as well as other nefarious operators around the world. And so, in one of my recent studies, what we were looking at is kind of cross examining what is the best approach to detecting IU phishing. Is it using this dark fleet, as it's referred to, as data when ships just turn off their data? Or is it some combination of FOC? And what we found is that it's roughly equal, which is a good thing, and it supports past research. But it's good that we're developing new ways to better detect these likely illegal activities going on. And then with my second example, this is mostly about understanding transshipments. And so if you don't know, most fishing vessels will spend months, if not a year, or up to 2 years at sea, and they don't actually go back to port. What they will do is they will offload their catch in the middle of the ocean, and that is a transshipment to a much larger ship that then goes to port. Well, what we wanted to understand is, how is that contributing to IU fishing, and what importance do ports play around the world? And what we found was that there are specific ports that are much more favorable to illegal activity occurring in their ports and at the ports, but also that these transshipments oftentimes take place where illegal activity has occurred. They oftentimes take place right outside of exclusive economic zones. So, out of any country's jurisdiction, they're in what's referred to as the high seas. There is no enforcement here. And we've actually seen where these fishing vessels will kind of create what I refer to as blind spots. So the inverse of a hotspot, if you've probably seen a crime hotspot map, lit up area on the map is where all the crime is. Well, what we're actually seeing is that, if you see my finger on the screen, you will see kind of these areas that don't have any fishing activity, but all this fishing activity, and also with overlays of species distributions, we know there's fish there that's commercially available all around those areas. And what's happening is that these ships are entering into these areas, turning off their signals, illegally catching fish, coming back out somewhere else, turning their signal on, meeting a transshipment, and then that transshipment goes to specific ports. And in combination with understanding which ships are most likely actually doing this type of activity and some other variables, we really were able to map out, where is the highest transshipment activity that involves IUU activity or fishing occurring, and then also which ports around the world are contributing to this activity. And we actually found that there's really about 4% of the ports we examined accounting for roughly 36% of all illegal or IU fishing transshipments being offloaded. So this is actually kind of a universal finding in traditional criminology as well, that most crime in most areas is either done by a few individuals or it just occurs at a few locations. You may be familiar with what's referred to as the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. 80% of something is accounted by 20% of something else. That holds true in criminology as well. The vast majority of crime occurs in just a few select locations, and we found evidence to support that with IU fishing and port activity as well. So, what I would like to kind of leave this off with is avenues for potential collaboration. As myself, yeah, I am a social scientist now, but I do have a strong background in GIS, spatial methodology, as well as the traditional natural resources. So I think, unlike some of my other colleagues that kind of are very traditional sociologists and criminologists, I bring a unique set of understanding from kind of both ends of the spectrum, where I'm trying to blend these disciplines to understand wildlife poaching and other natural resource crime. I've served on PhD committees, and I know there are students here, and usually those are for mathematics or like sociology based topics. But I'm open to any type of collaboration with PhD students, master students, as well as other faculty at your university. And that really can be me providing my social science expertise, spatial methodological expertise. If anyone's interested in natural resource crime or wildlife poaching, those are things that I am mostly studying now going forward in my attempt to get tenure in a few years. I do always like to point out I use R and particularly QGIS, both open source, but usually just R for all of my analysis. And that makes things oftentimes easier to collaborate with others that use R. And I'm also interested if anyone's has connections or interest in studying conservation law enforcement more specifically. If you look at the literature on conservation law enforcement, pretty much all of it is just based in Africa, very little in North America, except for a few studies from the 80s. Currently, I'm working on a number of projects related to IU fishing, kind of have a group of researchers doing that. And we're just kind of trading off responsibilities as we move through these projects. Currently starting projects related to the allocation of law enforcement resources, as well as flora and fauna trafficking. I'd mentioned Venus flytraps earlier. I'm kind of interested in looking into that a little bit more. And then I'm working on a few studies related to climate change, natural disasters, and water, and the kind of intersections between those topics, as well as public health and consequences related to crime as well. So I know it's less formal chatting here through Zoom. Obviously, there's still time to ask questions. But if you have additional questions outside of this, my email is posted here. You can always feel free to email me. And I usually get back pretty quickly, unlike some of our colleagues that we probably know, or maybe you are yourself that way, but that's fine. So thank you all. Feel free to ask anything.
Thank you so much, Dylan. This is really interesting. I know I learned a lot kind of through that opportunity spectrum. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Hey, Jared, I see somebody, Jody.
Hello, sir. First of all, thank you so much. I deal a lot with search and rescue in wilderness areas, and we've been running into some legality issues dealing with rescuing people, determining their status compared to an urban environment, especially in the South, like determining if they're deceased or not. Have you ever, I know that's not dealing directly with wildlife, but we're in wilderness areas. Do you have ever dealt with any of those aspects at all? And if you can elaborate, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I haven't actually dealt with any of that. I have, when I was actually working on the Appalachian Trail, we had to kind of mandatorily participate in a search and rescue mission up in Maine. Unfortunately, that didn't end well. But I do understand what you're saying, kind of the issues pertaining to one, obviously accessing these areas and finding this individual. I think maybe technology, as I had mentioned earlier, with drones could aid in particularly search and rescue missions. But me personally, I haven't really come across anything about that topic. But it is interesting nonetheless. Does that kind of answer your question though, or do you mean to elaborate a little more?
I can shoot you an email. It's a very specific situation
Okay,
with the
yeah, feel free.
laws.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? Anybody else? Well, Dylan, I think I had a really cool skill set, that us and Warnell could definitely use in a lot of our research projects. So hopefully the wildlife folks, and then even like the forester, and I studied tourism, this kind of this framework of like where the opportunities lie for crime and for people to act badly in different scenarios is really interesting. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, along the lines of tourism, I am currently working on two projects related to overcrowding in national parks, as well as disorder that could potentially lead to more legitimate or traditional crime in national parks as well. Yeah, I'm looking into kind of those avenues as well. There's a lot to be researched in these areas just because there's not a lot of people doing it. So I kind of get sidetracked on some of these topics. But yeah, thank you all for having me. Like I said, if there's any other questions, just feel free to shoot me an email.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Sure,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It definitely seems that this is a little bit more of like a niche subcategory of like overall criminology. So I just kind of wanted to ask like what the extent of this research really is, like maybe at GSU, but also like other universities that might be like more heavily involved in this particular field.
Yeah, no, you were absolutely correct. This is very niche. Even so that, each discipline has their own traditional journals. Most of the wildlife research that I do and my colleagues do, it has to be published in other disciplines. Journals like biological conservation or conservation biology are pretty common, which those are very well regarded journals in their own right. So that's a good thing. Generally, there's just, as I said, a handful of us. One of them is in New York. The other two are in Florida at Florida International and the University of Central Florida. So we're each kind of siloed by ourselves. There's not really a department that has multiple wildlife crime researchers. And honestly, how I had to sell myself on the job market was as a spatial methodologist. A traditional crim program doesn't necessarily want a wildlife criminologist, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a handful of us. And what we see is oftentimes we have to work together from the social science aspect. But I particularly am reaching out more so to individuals that are much more traditional in understanding ecology and wildlife biology. Because they really are interested oftentimes in understanding, I study this animal and I know there are issues related to trafficking or poaching, but I've never really thought about addressing those issues. And that's why I'm trying to introduce myself and my expertise to be able to help them in their own lines of research and interest areas.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the opportunities are endless with this research. I think there's a lot to do. So maybe natural resources schools will actually be more interested in this because it's kind of definitely a new perspective that I don't think we've thought about.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I was thinking that you were mentioning no wildlife or forestry, but this really applies to every of our disciplines because it's as Dylan was saying, there's opportunity for crime in every single action that we do from salt and resources to everything. So unfortunately, but I think there will be application of your science in any single discipline of each of us is working with. from the more technical, biological to the more social, everything.
Yeah, and I always try to give really specific examples to my students that are new to these topics because people don't realize there really is opportunity with pretty much all natural resources. I'm a fly fisherman, and one of the books that I've assigned to students before is about the stealing of rare feathers in museums from certain bird species that were historically used to tie flies. I mean, the spectrum of what people do is insane, honestly. So, yeah, unfortunately, there is a lot of opportunity to study all kinds of topics.
Are there any other questions?
Well, Dylan, I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person. It would have been great to have you here, but let's give him a round of applause, you know, for people that are virtually. So
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Yeah, it was unfortunate the weather, but it is what it is.
All right. Well, I will stop recording at this moment.